In the deepest depths of esotericism, there circulates a book that was never promoted, only whispered about. For years, it was treated almost like sensitive material, not because it taught mystical parlor tricks, but because it touches on something more delicate, your way of understanding reality. Some considered it too uncomfortable, too revealing, to leave it in just anyone's hands. It doesn't hit you with truths. It drops them on you little by little, as if it knew that not everyone is ready to handle them. That book has a name, the Kybalion. And once you understand what it proposes, you can no longer pretend you didn't see it. Attributed to anonymous sages of Hermeticism, its content was treated like intellectual dynamite, not because it taught cheap magic, but because it proposed something much more uncomfortable, that reality is not what you think, and that you have more power than you've been told. That's why that knowledge was reserved for initiates, for those who were willing to look beyond the facade. Now then, what really is the Kybalion? And why did a book that talks about universal principles end up surrounded by that aura of prohibition? How can a text from over a century ago promise such a radical change in the way you perceive the world? Is it believed that it was first published in 1910 or 1908, signed by the three initiates, with no names, no faces, just that enigmatic signature? Everything points to it appearing in Chicago, but even that detail remains shrouded in mystery. What the text does state is that it condenses Hermetic teachings passed down since antiquity, supposedly linked to Hermes Trismegistus. Its intention was clear: to take 7 ancient principles, dense, complex, almost cryptic, and turn them into something understandable and applicable. Not an abstract treatise for scholars, but a map for anyone seeking to understand the invisible laws that govern the universe and use them for their own growth. At a time when interest in mysticism was on the rise, the Kybalion appeared as a bridge between the ancient and the modern. It didn't just offer theory, it offered perspective. With each chapter, it pushes you to look at reality from a broader angle and, if you dare, a more uncomfortable one. Because this book is not simply a list of 7 spiritual rules. It's a complete framework. 7 principles that work as master keys to decipher what usually goes unnoticed. From the radical idea that the all is mind to the principle of gender, it permeates every corner of the cosmos and offers a sophisticated, almost surgical vision of how existence operates. And its influence didn't just stay on paper. Hermeticism permeated philosophical currents, medieval alchemists, and modern mystical schools, leaving its mark on different cultures and eras. It wasn't a passing fad, it was a constant underground current. Thus, the Kybalion is not just an ancient manual, it's the reflection of an eternal human obsession to understand what seems impossible to understand. And when you immerse yourself in it, you don't just read. You are faced with an invitation to question your certainties, to grow suspicious of what you take for granted, to awaken something that may have been waiting for centuries. Welcome to the universe of the Kybalion. Now let's get down to business. The 7 Hermetic principles. They are presented as interconnected universal laws. They don't work in isolation. They form a system, an invisible architecture that, according to the text, sustains reality. The first is the principle of mentalism, and this is where it gets uncomfortable. The all is mind. That means the universe is not just matter. It's a mental construct. The reality you experience would be the result of a universal mind. And your own thoughts are not just passing thoughts, but active forces that shape your experience. In other words, you don't just observe reality, you participate in its creation. Interestingly, this idea doesn't sound so far-fetched if we look at modern physics. In quantum mechanics, the act of observing not only reveals a phenomenon, it alters it. reality responds to the consciousness that observes it. And that opens a dangerous door. If the mind influences the structure of what exists, then thinking is not an innocent act. Understanding mentalism implies accepting that intention and conscious thought could have a real impact on the very fabric of your life. Not as a motivational metaphor, but as an operating principle. The second principle is the principle of correspondence. As above, so below, as below, so above. This axiom suggests that everything is connected by repeating patterns. What happens on the macro level is mirrored at the micro level. The same structures you see in the cosmos, orbits, cycles, rhythms, are replicated in biological, psychological, and even spiritual processes. It's not a coincidence, it's coherence. The architecture of the universe manifests at every level, from galaxies to thoughts, from solar systems to human emotions. Everything responds to an order that repeats itself, as if reality were an infinite fractal unfolding at different scales. And if that's true, then understanding one level allows you to understand the others. And we're only on the second principle. When you truly understand the principle of correspondence, something changes. You start to notice that what happens in the immense is reflected in the tiny. The universe stops seeming like random chaos and starts to show repeating patterns. The macrocosm and the microcosm are not separate worlds. They are mirrors. For centuries, philosophers and scientists have used this idea to build bridges between the visible and the invisible, between heaven and earth, or between the spiritual and the material. Not as pretty poetry, but as a way to decipher what, at first glance, seems incomprehensible. Now let's move on to the third principle, vibration. This is where things get interesting. Nothing is still. Absolutely nothing. Everything moves. Everything vibrates. From the farthest galaxy to the most microscopic particle, everything is in constant oscillation, emitting its own frequency. That perpetual movement is not a technical detail. It's the engine of transformation. What changes, what manifests, what evolves, all happens because something vibrates at a certain frequency. If you think about it, the universe is a symphony, and every element, including you, is a note within that composition. The question is, are you in tune or are you out of tune? Understanding vibration means recognizing that by adjusting your own frequency,
pensamientos, emociones, estados internos,
you can influence what you attract and create. Not as cheap superstition, but through resonance. Modern physics supports this when it talks about waves, energies, and fields. Everything that exists is ultimately vibrating energy. And if everything vibrates, then your internal state matters more than you thought. The fourth principle is the principle of polarity. And here we break down another illusion. Everything has two poles, heat and cold, light and darkness, love and hate. But they are not irreconcilable enemies. They are extremes of the same axis. They are not absolute opposites. They are different degrees of the same thing. Cold is not the opposite of heat. It is less heat. Sadness is not the opposite of joy. It's a variation in the emotional spectrum. When you understand this, you stop fighting against your internal states and start working with them. Because if everything is a matter of degrees, then you can move along the spectrum. You can transform anger into determination, fear into caution, pain into learning. It's not magic. It's conscious management of polarities. Even science plays with this idea. In physics, for example, every particle has its counterpart, matter and antimatter. Two sides of the same structure. Nothing is isolated. Everything has its mirror. Then comes the principle of rhythm. Here we talk about cycles, about inevitable oscillations, about ups and downs that don't ask for permission. We see it in the seasons, in day and night, in financial markets, in social trends, Everything moves in waves, advances and retreats, grows and shrinks. The key is not to stop the pendulum because you can't, but to learn to anticipate it. Farmers plant and harvest according to the natural rhythm. Businesses plan with the understanding that the economy is cyclical. And in your personal life, your emotions, your energy, your productivity also follow patterns. Ignoring those cycles is exhausting. Going with them is strategic. When you recognize your own internal rhythm, your moments of expansion and your moments of withdrawal, you start making smarter decisions. You stop expecting yourself to be summer in the middle of an emotional winter. And that, believe me, saves a lot of unnecessary frustration. Finally, we come to the sixth principle. And yes, this one usually generates curiosity. The principle of gender. Gender is in everything, and everything has masculine and feminine principles. But we're not just talking about biology. This isn't a superficial conversation about men and women. It's a deeper idea. All creation involves two complementary forces. One is active, one is receptive. One drives, the other brings forth. These energies coexist in everything, in nature, in the mind, in creative processes, in you. Action needs direction. An idea needs to gestate. Initiative needs structure. These are dynamics that work together, not in competition. And when you understand that, you start to see that balance is not weakness, it's power well managed. And there's still one more principle to explore.
El principio de género
It's not a biological label. It's a powerful statement about how the universe works. It talks about duality or something like that, but above all about complementarity. It refers to energies, to qualities present in everything that exists. The masculine is usually associated with drive, direction, logic, action. The feminine with intuition, creativity, the ability to nurture and sustain. But be careful, they're not divided by gender. They don't come with a built-in identity. We all have both forces in different proportions at different times. When you act with determination, you're using one kind of energy. When you listen, process, and shape an idea, you're using the other. And when both work together, creation happens. It's that simple, that profound. And now we come to the seventh principle, cause and effect. There's no vague mysticism here. There's a straightforward law. Nothing happens by chance. Every action creates a consequence. Every decision opens one door and closes another. From classical physics to your everyday life, everything follows this invisible chain of causes and effects. In science, it's unquestionable. Every action has a reaction. In personal life, it means something just as clear. You are responsible. Your words have an impact. Your habits produce results. Your thoughts, repeated over time, shape direction. Understanding cause and effect changes the way you live because you no longer react automatically. You start to choose more consciously. You know that what you sow today, you will reap later. And no, it's not a cosmic threat. It's an elegant warning. Living by this principle means observing yourself, asking yourself before you act. Assume that every move leaves a mark on you and on your surroundings. When you put the seven principles together, what you get today is not just a collection of inspiring phrases, it's a system, a framework to understand the complete dance of existence.
desde lo más diminuto,
reality. When these laws recur, manifest themselves, and operate, and if you learn to read them, you can navigate reality with more strategy and less improvisation. Now then, what impact does all this have on the way you perceive the world? This is where the Kybalion stops being theory and starts to become lived experience. Immersing yourself in these principles not only broadens your intellectual understanding, it changes your perception, it changes how you see yourself, it changes how you interpret what happens to you. You start to notice connections where you used to see chaos, you see patterns where there used to be randomness. You understand that you are not isolated. You are integrated into an interdependent system. Transformation often begins with something uncomfortable, realizing that your perception is not neutral. It is filtered by beliefs, thoughts, internal narratives, exactly what mentalism proposes. When you accept that you participate in the construction of your experience, you regain power. You stop feeling like a victim of the circumstances. What are you mentally holding on to that is influencing this? That change of focus is not small, it's radical. Many who study and apply these principles describe a renewed sense of direction, more clarity, more purpose, and more coherence between what they think and what they do. Some say that understanding polarity allowed them to reconcile with parts of themselves they used to reject as flaws. They began to see it as an extreme that could be adjusted. Others, by understanding rhythm and vibration, stopped fighting against emotional lows and began to use them as moments for adjustment, because they understood that the pendulum always moves and that resisting it only creates unnecessary strain. There are those who discovered, thanks to the principle of correspondence, that their internal process reflected patterns they saw in nature: growth, pause, transformation. And that similarity generated something powerful: connection. And there are also those who integrated the principle of gender into their daily life, balancing their logical drive with their intuition. Result: more creative decisions, more innovative solutions, more harmonious relationships. These are not fantasy stories, but perceptions that produce changes in behavior. And when your behavior changes, your results change. That is the true impact of the Kybalion. It doesn't ask you to believe blindly. It invites you to observe, to apply, to experiment. And when you do that, reality stops seeming like something that just happens to you. It starts to feel like something you actively participate in. When you take on this deeper, more strategic perspective, something gets activated. The Hermetic principles stop being ancient theory and become triggers for growth. They work as catalysts. They force you to broaden your thinking, to question your limits, and to redraw your path. It's not just information, it's transformation in motion. At its core, the Kybalion doesn't impose beliefs. It invites you on a journey. It tells you, explore, observe, experiment. Dare to look at the mysteries of the universe, but also your own, because both are more connected than you imagine. However, I'm going to tell you something straight. If you're listening to this halfway through the video, you have more discipline than 80% who already went to watch cat shorts. Write in the comments, "I'm ready to use the knowledge, not to accumulate it, to use it." And if you say it in the comments, make sure it's because you're going to prove it. On the other hand, a clear example of its influence can be found in Manly P. Hall, an esoteric thinker and writer deeply committed to the study of mysticism and philosophy. In the Kybalion, he found principles that fell into place as key parts of his spiritual quest. In his work, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, Hall spread many Hermetic teachings, highlighting their power for self-knowledge and inner transformation. He didn't approach it as a historical curiosity, but as a living tool. His work demonstrates something interesting. These principles were not trapped in the past. They continue to impact restless minds, continue to shape perspectives, continue to spark uncomfortable questions, the kind that change lives. Thanks to figures like Hall, the Kybalion reached generations of seekers, people who were not satisfied with superficial explanations and wanted to understand the invisible laws behind what is visible. And now we come to the end, or rather a strategic pause. Throughout this journey, we have broken down ideas that, on the surface, sound simple. Mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, gender, cause and effect. But when you put them together, they form a powerful system. They're not motivational phrases for a coffee mug, they're operational tools. They're lenses that change how you interpret what you experience.
La pregunta es inevitable.
What happens when you decide to really apply this? What changes when you start thinking with an awareness of cause and effect? When you observe your polarities instead of fighting with them? When you understand that your mind is not a spectator but a participant? The Kybalion is not an endpoint, it's a doorway. And behind that door, there aren't definitive answers. There's more exploration. Because each principle, when properly applied, opens new layers of understanding. In your modern life, in your daily decisions, in your search for purpose. By integrating them into your routine, you not only transform your personal reality, you connect with a stream of knowledge that has flowed through centuries. A stream that doesn't depend on trends, but on laws. And here's where it gets interesting. A beginning in disguise. The Kybalion is not a book to just collect on a shelf. It's an uncomfortable and fascinating companion. A map that doesn't tell you exactly where to go, but does teach you how to read the terrain. So the real question isn't whether the Kybalion works. The question is, are you going to just watch, or are you going to cross the threshold? Because wisdom doesn't chase anyone, it waits. And it only responds to those who dare to seek.